They did not see the enemy. They did not hear him coming. And for a few seconds, the island was allowed to believe it was still in control. Then the shoreline detonated. Not from the sky, no aircraft engines, no bombs falling, no silhouettes cutting across the moon. The first impact arrived like a verdict, a hard white flash that turned palm shadows into sharp black blades. A heartbeat later came the sound, deep, metallic, and distant, like thunder disciplined into rhythm. The men in the bunkers understood something immediately and terrifyingly simple. Whatever was firing at them was not within the range of their eyes. Searchlights swept the sea and found nothing but darkness. Spotters scanned for masts and wakes. Nothing. The defenders had trained for raids, for landings, for the familiar logic of an assault. This was different. The shells came from beyond the horizon, from a place the human body could not point to and the mind could not measure. Some rounds arrived before the sound of the guns reached shore, so the order of reality flipped. Impact first, explanation second. Concrete bunkers built to resist mortars and small-caliber fire began to fail in ways their engineers never imagined. Doors buckled inward. Sandbags became airborne. The air inside shelters turned into choking dust and pressure. Men were not only wounded by fragments, they were battered by physics, by concussion that stole hearing, balance, and time. A bunker could survive a direct hit and still kill the men inside by turning breath into pain. Naval gunfire did more than destroy positions. It erased the idea that land was a refuge. The sea, once a moat protecting the island, had become a firing platform. An entire coastline was being revised by unseen hands, shell by shell, methodically, without haste. And as communications died, wires severed, radios drowned in static, runners swallowed by the dark, the officers faced a new kind of terror. Not chaos, but order. Someone out there was aiming. Someone was correcting. Someone was learning the island's shape in real time. The shock was not the violence alone, it was the precision, proof that this war would not be decided by courage first, but by calculation. Imperial Japan did not enter the Pacific War without a plan. It entered with a tradition, an inherited belief about how great wars at sea were supposed to be decided. In Japanese naval thinking, victory was not a slow grind. It was a single, decisive collision. Fleets closing like swords, torpedoes striking in the dark, honor proven in the moment where distance collapsed and courage could be witnessed. That doctrine had reasons. Japan's planners studied Mahan, measured fuel, weighed geography, and concluded that they could not win an endless industrial contest. So they designed a war that would end quickly, carriers to cripple, submarines to harass, night-fighting cruisers and destroyers to finish what daylight began. The long lance torpedo became a symbol of that faith. One weapon, one strike, one sudden reversal. Sustained bombardment, slow, expensive, repetitive, felt like an inefficient use of steel. Along the islands, defenses were built with the same assumptions. Coastal guns and bunkers were positioned to punish landing craft, to break assaults at the waterline, to force the enemy into close combat where terrain and sacrifice could compensate for shortages. These fortifications expected invasion. They did not truly expect annihilation delivered from offshore with heavy shells fired beyond sight, adjusted by instruments, repeated without pause. Worse still, Japan's war effort was not a single mind. The Army and Navy competed for resources, prestige, and control, often planning in parallel rather than together. What one branch learned, the other did not always absorb. What one feared, the other dismissed. Unity of defense was spoken of as a virtue, but rivalry shaped reality. In pre-war exercises, American strength was treated as a variable that could be managed, an opponent who might hesitate, negotiate, or tire. The scale of American production was acknowledged in theory, yet rarely felt as a physical certainty. In its place, Japanese leaders leaned on something harder to quantify and easier to believe: spirit, endurance, the willingness to die. It was not ignorance that doomed them at first. It was preparation for a different kind of war, one where bravery could close the gap before arithmetic did. And out on the black water, American naval guns were about to prove just how wide that gap had become. For the United States, the Pacific War was never only a contest of courage, it was a contest of systems. Washington and the Navy Department looked at distance, tonnage, and time the way an engineer looks at stress and load. The question was not merely how to win a battle, but how to generate victories reliably, month after month, across an ocean half the world wide. That approach shaped the fleet before the war even reached its midpoint. Naval guns were not treated as unique masterpieces, but as repeatable solutions, standardized, improved, and produced in numbers that turned replacement into routine. Barrels could be swapped, mounts serviced, shells delivered by the trainload. In an American war, metal did not just exist. It arrived on schedule. Inside the battleships, another transformation was happening, one quieter than armor or caliber and more decisive than either. Fire control evolved from skill into method. Rangefinders, plotting rooms, and stabilized directors turned rolling ships into platforms of measured violence. Salvos were not simply fired, they were computed, corrected, bracketed, walked onto a target like a pencil line narrowing into certainty. A battleship became less a duelist and more a moving artillery battery. Then radar entered the equation and the old uncertainties began to die. Night, haze, and distance no longer offered the same protection. Targets could be detected beyond visual range, tracked without flares, and engaged with a confidence that would have seemed unnatural only a decade earlier. The sea did not have to be seen to be controlled. Behind all of it stood the deepest American advantage: ammunition. Not a few shells saved for the perfect moment, but entire stockpiles designed for sustained fire. Manufactured, shipped, stacked, and replenished at a tempo Japan could not match and could barely imagine. The gun was only as powerful as the chain that fed it, and America built that chain like a factory floor stretched across an ocean. Training followed the same logic: repetition, coordination, accuracy. Crews drilled until procedures became instinct, and instinct became routine. In the American model, surprise was not luck. It was preparation made invisible. By the time the first island coastlines erupted under unseen salvos, the shock felt sudden to those on shore. But long before the first shell landed, the outcome had already been engineered. Even as the war turned against them, many Japanese planners continued to see the ocean through the lens that had shaped their rise. The carrier, not the battleship, was the instrument of decision. Air power would find the enemy first, strike from afar, and make heavy guns an afterthought. Slow, exposed, and unnecessary. In that worldview, the battleship was a relic, kept for prestige or for the moment when aircraft had already done the real work. Shore bombardment, too, was often treated as theater. Noise meant to impress, shells wasted on rock and jungle, a prelude that could never break a determined garrison. A fortress, they believed, was not defeated by weight of fire. It was defeated when men were forced into close struggle, when the attacker paid in blood for every yard and eventually lost the will to continue. So defenses evolved in the direction that matched that belief. Caves were carved deeper, tunnels multiplied like roots, infantry were dispersed to avoid a single catastrophic strike. Hardened positions were designed to survive raids and to delay landings long enough to impose the decisive thing Japan still trusted most: attrition of spirit. Underneath it all was an assumption as old as warfare itself, that the human will can endure almost any punishment if it is wrapped in duty and meaning. Soldiers were taught that suffering could be mastered, that fear could be disciplined, that the body could be commanded by belief. But intelligence in war is only useful when it is allowed to wound pride. Reports warning of American gunnery improvements, long-range accuracy, radar correction, sustained fire, were often received with caution, then quietly filed behind older convictions. To accept them fully was to admit something unforgivable: that the enemy had found a way to make sacrifice predictable. And so, victory was imagined not as dominance of fire, but as moral endurance, an equation in which Japan's capacity to suffer would outlast America's capacity to spend. The empire did not lack courage. It lacked a willingness to revise the rules of the game while the game was still being played. because the beliefs that had once carried Japan to astonishing victories were now becoming armor that could not bend. And in the dark beyond the horizon, American gunnery was preparing to test how long certainty can survive against mathematics. The bunkers were built with care, reinforced concrete poured into forms, timbers braced, firing ports measured to cover beaches and ravines. In peacetime calculations, and in the limited bombardments Japan had studied, these positions looked solid, almost permanent. They were meant to resist field guns, mortar fire, and the scattered violence of air attack. They were meant to buy time. But the American shells that began to fall on the islands did not belong to those earlier assumptions. A battleship's main battery did not simply strike, it compressed the world. The weight of the projectile, the speed of impact, the explosive fill, everything about it exceeded what many island fortifications had truly been tested against. Concrete that seemed invulnerable under one kind of pressure behaved differently under another. It cracked, it spalled, it turned inward. Japanese engineers had not been foolish. They had been practical within the limits of what they believed the enemy would do. Yet they underestimated something that could not be easily pictured from a drafting table: the difference between harassment and method, between a few rounds and an afternoon of continuous fire, between a shell that lands and a pattern that returns, corrected, until it finds the seam in your protection. Terrain, too, was expected to be an ally. Jungle, ridgelines, volcanic rock. These were supposed to blunt naval gunfire, to hide positions, to force the attacker into close range. Instead, the landscape became a map for the guns. Slopes channeled blast, ravines became funnels of concussion, trees shattered into splinters that behaved like shrapnel. A cave entrance that could not be seen from the sea could still be sealed by a near miss that collapsed the earth around it. Defensive depth, layer upon layer of tunnels and fallback positions, began to reveal its darker side. Under sustained shelling, depth did not always mean survivability. It meant more space for smoke, dust, and pressure to travel, more corridors to fill, more wounded to carry through passages that were now blocked, flooding, or simply gone. Medical posts collapsed first, not from direct hits alone, but from relentless concussion. Supplies could not move. Water lines broke, radios failed. The body's needs, sleep, air, coherence, became scarce commodities. Survivors would later struggle for language. Many described it not as being attacked, but as being shaken loose from the earth itself, an island trembling under invisible hands. Protection had been real once. Now it was revealed as an illusion, one that the next bombardment would strip away even faster. The Pacific War offered warnings early, clear, violent demonstrations that the old assumptions were breaking apart. In the first American landings, Japanese garrisons watched shorelines churn under naval fire and saw for the first time what sustained bombardment could do to fixed positions. It should have been a lesson written in smoke, but lessons in wartime do not travel automatically. They move through institutions, through pride, rivalry, paperwork, and the quiet human need to believe yesterday's logic will still protect tomorrow. Guadalcanal, for example, delivered painful evidence. The Americans could bring ships close, use them aggressively, and coordinate sea power with land operations in ways Japan had not anticipated. Yet much of what was learned remained compartmentalized, held within specific commands, filtered through reports, diluted by distance, and too often reduced to a local problem rather than a strategic warning. To revise doctrine in the middle of a war is to admit that earlier certainty was flawed, and Japan's command structure, already strained by Army-Navy divisions and competing priorities, was not built for that kind of self-correction. The pressure of emergency encourages tradition, not experimentation. It rewards obedience. It punishes the officer who speaks too plainly about structural weakness. Cultural rigidity played its own role. Adaptation requires not just new tactics, but new language, new ways of thinking about defeat before it happens. Yet many island defenses continued to be framed as moral tests. A garrison must hold, must endure, must impose a cost. Each island became a proving ground for spirit rather than a laboratory for method. The question was not how do we neutralize their fire, but how long can we survive it? Meanwhile, the Americans were learning with a different kind of discipline. Their gunners were not improvising heroically in the moment. They were refining craft, collecting data, correcting patterns, improving coordination between spotters, radar, and plotting rooms. Every bombardment became practice for the next. Every shoreline became another set of numbers to perfect. And so the imbalance deepened quietly. Evidence accumulated like ash, settling over reports and ruins. But belief, once it hardens, does not soften easily. By the time Japan fully recognized what naval gunfire had become, the Americans had already turned it into routine. By 1943 and 1944, American battleships were no longer waiting for the decisive surface duel Japan had once promised itself. Their great guns, 14-inch, 16-inch, had been reassigned a new purpose. They became instruments of land warfare, designed to reach inland through jungle and rock, and to do it with a discipline that looked less like rage and more like procedure. This transformation was not only about caliber, it was about integration. Spotter aircraft circled above the islands like slow, patient eyes, watching where shells landed and speaking corrections back to ships hidden over the horizon. Radar, meanwhile, quietly stitched sea and sky together. It measured range without sunlight, tracked targets through haze, and reduced the guesswork that had once protected defenders at night. When visibility failed, instruments did not. In plotting rooms, below armored decks, firing tables evolved from reference books into predictive tools. Wind, humidity, barrel wear, the ship's roll, variables were entered, recalculated, corrected. Each salvo was part of a conversation between physics and intent. The first rounds tested the answer, the next rounds refined it, the final rounds delivered it, and the pace increased. American crews learned how to sustain fire, how to load, elevate, and fire again and again without losing accuracy. Shells moved up from magazines in steady streams. Turrets swung with measured confidence. What might have been a rare expenditure earlier in the war became a methodical routine. Bombard, adjust, repeat. For the defenders, it felt as if the island was being surveyed by violence. Japanese positions were not simply struck, they were located. A machine gun nest that survived one pattern of fire often found itself bracketed in the next. A cave mouth that remained hidden one day might be sealed the next by a round placed a few yards closer. The island's defensive geometry was rewritten shell by shell, as if someone were drawing lines through the terrain with invisible ink. War in those hours became an equation solved repeatedly. The Americans did not need inspiration to continue firing, they needed coordinates, they needed time. The guns supplied the rest. And innovation, once married to industrial scale, has a cruel momentum. Every improvement, every better radar return, every smoother ammunition flow did not merely increase efficiency, it accelerated destruction. And on the islands, Japanese soldiers were about to discover what it means to fight not an enemy you can see, but a system that does not tire. A shell does not need to strike a man to destroy him. On the islands, Japanese soldiers learned this in the most intimate way, through pressure, through vibration, through the invisible violence that entered the body without leaving a clean wound. Prolonged bombardment turned concussion into a climate. The air itself became heavy, as if each blast briefly changed the rules of breathing. Men who survived direct hits on their positions often found their hearing fading first, then balance, then memory. The mind began to misfile time. Minutes stretched, hours vanished. Orders were repeated and forgotten in the same breath. In places where casualties were counted, the numbers did not always capture what was happening. Psychological collapse could eclipse physical injury, and a soldier still standing could be less capable than one carried away. Sleep became the rarest supply. Bombardments were not always continuous, but they were unpredictable enough to prevent rest. Every pause felt like a trap. Every silence could be the moment before another correction. Command posts that depended on clarity, maps, radios, voices, began to fracture. not because officers lacked courage, but because the nervous system cannot remain alert forever without breaking its own circuits. Veterans would later describe a particular terror, fear without a visible enemy. In conventional combat, danger has a direction. Here, danger arrived from everywhere and nowhere, measured by instruments far beyond the island's reach. The human mind searches for a target in order to endure. Naval gunfire offered none. Discipline struggled against that invisibility. Doctrine demanded endurance, stillness, obedience. But the body, battered by repeated shockwaves, began to revolt. Some men crawled deeper into tunnels not out of cowardice, but out of instinct, the ancient impulse to burrow away from thunder. Others emerged at the wrong moment, driven by panic, thirst, or the simple need for air. Survival instincts started to collide with the ideals they had been trained to serve. This was the struggle the Japanese garrison could not plan for on a map. Not a tactical problem, but a human one. How long can flesh and nerves remain organized under relentless physics? Because American shells were not merely destroying defenses, they were rewriting the inside of the men who held them. And once the battle moved inward, into the mind and the body, the island's doctrine of endurance began to unravel in ways no officer could command back into place. Japan did adapt, not quickly enough and not at the scale required, but the defenders were not blind. As bombardments intensified, garrisons dug deeper. Tunnels were extended into harder rock. Fighting positions were dispersed so that a single salvo could not erase an entire platoon. Caves were widened, entrances multiplied, and dummy positions built to mislead spotters. On paper, it looked like evolution, but adaptation is only as strong as what feeds it. Depth required tools, timber, concrete, ventilation, things increasingly scarce on isolated islands strangled by blockade and distance. Dispersion demanded radios, wire, runners, and coordinated supply. Yet the very fire they were adapting to was severing the nerves that made coordination possible. Bombardment did not simply destroy positions, it destroyed the connections between positions. Counter-battery fire, when attempted, revealed the harsh geometry of the situation. Coastal guns were often fixed, limited in traverse, and visible once they fired. American ships could shift position, fire from beyond sight, and use radar to correct. A shore battery might manage a few rounds before the answer arrived, cold, accurate, and overwhelming. The defenders learned that returning fire could be less a resistance than a signal flare. Then came the shortages. Ammunition was rationed like blood. A gun that cannot shoot might as well be a monument, and by the later stages of the war, many island garrisons possessed weapons without the means to sustain them. Shells were husbanded for landings that sometimes came after days of bombardment had already shattered the gun crews meant to fire them. Communication collapsed in layers. Telephone wires snapped and stayed snapped. Radios lost power or antennas. Runners became casualties in terrain that was constantly rearranging itself. Orders arrived late, distorted, or not at all. In that vacuum, improvisation replaced doctrine. Barricades made from broken beams, firing ports cut into fresh rubble, medical stations moved into deeper darkness. But improvisation cannot outpace a system. Each new defensive trick was met by an adjustment. New firing patterns, tighter corrections, heavier concentrations. Innovation arrived too late and too thin, scattered across islands that could not share resources or time. The struggle was no longer about whether Japan could endure. It was about whether Japan could respond, and with every unanswered salvo, the balance tilted further, toward an enemy who could afford to learn faster than the defenders could rebuild. There comes a moment in every war when theory is forced to stand in open daylight. For Japan, that moment arrived on an island where the bombardment was not a prelude. It was the main act. The sea filled with American ships, and the horizon became a line of controlled violence, delivering fire with a scale and patience the defenders had never experienced in full. For days, shells arrived in measured waves, not random destruction, but a schedule. Batteries worked targets in sequence: ridges, suspected command posts, artillery sites, cave mouths, beach defenses, each receiving its turn under heavy caliber. Spotter aircraft and shipboard radar corrected the fall, tightening patterns until the island's strong points were no longer positions, but coordinates awaiting deletion. The timing was surgical. Fire lifted, shifted, returned, as if the shoreline were being prepared like ground for an operation already decided. By the time landing craft began to move toward the beaches, many defensive lines had been erased in a way maps could not describe. The enemy on shore had not been softened. It had been rearranged. Trenches collapsed, firing lanes buried, wires severed, ammunition scattered, men reduced to small groups without cohesion. In some sectors, the 1st American Infantry did not meet organized resistance because there was no longer an organization to meet. Inside shattered command posts, Japanese officers faced an awful clarity. The battle was not unfolding, it had already happened. They could still order counterattacks, still demand endurance, still invoke honor, but the material shape of the defense, its guns, its communications, its protected movement, was gone. What remained was courage stripped of the structure that makes courage effective. Survivors emerged from tunnels and collapsed shelters with faces coated in dust, ears ringing into silence, eyes blinking as if the sun itself was foreign. Many were not wounded in the traditional sense. They were disoriented, deafened, concussed, detached from time. They stepped into daylight and found a landscape that no longer resembled the island they had been defending. For the Americans, the result was stark and measurable. Casualties fell, not because the landings were easy, but because resistance had been broken before the first rifle fired. The relationship between firepower and survival became undeniable. This was the island that proved the equation. If you could deliver enough precise naval gunfire, you could decide the battle before you touched the beach. And Japan, watching the pattern repeat, began to understand that the future held fewer battles and more executions by schedule. Even under bombardment, courage did not disappear. On shattered islands, men still crawled forward with grenades, still dragged wounded comrades through choking dust, still climbed out of wrecked shelters to man a gun that might fire only once. Bravery persisted because it was not an emotion, it was a habit, trained into the body long before the first shell arrived. Orders continued as well. Command posts, half buried and half deaf, transmitted directives that assumed an intact battlefield. Hold the line, counterattack at dusk, preserve ammunition for the landing. In many cases, those orders were carried out not because they were realistic, but because obedience was the last remaining structure in a world whose physical structures had been erased. To refuse an order was to admit the war had changed beyond recognition. This was where tactical courage met mechanical certainty. A small group could fight fiercely in a ravine, could ambush a patrol, could die with discipline. But it could not silence the guns offshore. It could not cut the radar beam that corrected the next salvo. It could not stop the next wave of shells from arriving with the calm reliability of a machine doing what it was built to do. Honor had been designed for an older logic, one where the battlefield could still be shaped by individual decision and visible sacrifice. Now honor confronted industrial arithmetic. The attacker could calculate fire missions. The defender could only endure them. The result was not a contest of wills so much as a contest between will and physics does not bargain. In such a place, the battlefield offered no redemption. There were moments of heroism, but heroism no longer altered the outcome. A man could win a firefight and still lose the island by the next morning. A commander could inspire a last stand and still find that the last stand occurred inside a crater that had not existed yesterday. Losses became mathematically predictable, not because the defenders were weak, but because the pattern of destruction followed repeatable rules. When your positions are mapped, when your communications are severed, when your movement is watched and corrected for, the margin for human surprise collapses. The war begins to resemble an accounting. That is why this climax carries moral weight. It is not a story of failed courage, it is a story of courage placed into a system that had found a way to make courage insufficient. And as Japan faced that truth, the next question was unavoidable. What happens to an empire built on endurance when endurance can be measured and exhausted by design? When the bombardment finally stopped, the first sensation was not relief, it was absence. After days of concussion and rhythm, silence felt unnatural, like the world had been unplugged. Men waited for the next salvo out of habit, their bodies still braced for impacts that no longer came. In daylight, the island revealed what the guns had done. Ridges were shaved down, tree lines were gone, replaced by splintered stumps and gray dust. Craters overlapped like scales. Familiar paths had vanished under collapsed earth. What had once been a defensive landscape, mapped, numbered, assigned, was now a broken surface without names. The terrain had been rewritten so thoroughly that even those who had lived on it could no longer navigate it with confidence. More decisive than the physical damage was the disappearance of networks. Defensive systems rely on connection. Wires, runners, stockpiles, schedules, and the quiet certainty that a position on the map corresponds to a position in the world. After sustained naval fire, those connections were often gone. A machine gun might still exist, but without ammunition. A squad might still survive, but without orders. A command post might still stand, but without a functioning radio. What remained were fragments of resistance without the structure that makes resistance coherent. For Japanese survivors, this silence became a moment of reckoning. Many had been trained to see endurance as victory's foundation, to resist until the enemy's will failed. Now they stood in a landscape where will had not been defeated by fear, but by disassembly. The meaning of holding began to shift when there was nothing left to hold from and nowhere left to assemble. Across the water, American commanders viewed the results differently. They walked through the aftermath with notebooks and maps, studying patterns of destruction with clinical attention. Which targets resisted longest? Which calibers produced which effects? How did timing affect the landing? The language was not emotional, it was operational. Data replaced speculation, and the next bombardment was already being improved in the mind. This is how wars evolve, not always through dramatic breakthroughs, but through quiet confirmation. The island had proven that naval gunfire applied methodically could alter the balance of blood, and as the fleet prepared to move on, the shockwave of those guns did not remain behind in the craters. It traveled forward into every plan, every landing, and every remaining island that still believed it could endure. By the later stages of the Pacific War, the evidence was no longer scattered. It was cumulative. Island after island had shown the same pattern. Offshore fire did not merely support an invasion, it could decide its opening terms. And with each repetition, Japan's strategic assumptions began to collapse under weight that no memorandum or speech could lift. The first assumption to die was the old promise of control. Japan had planned to shape the enemy's approach, to draw fleets into decisive engagements, to trade space for a moment of concentrated destruction. But naval gun dominance changed the geometry. American forces could reduce key positions before committing ground troops. They could turn shore defenses into rubble while their own infantry remained offshore, intact, waiting. The decisive battle did not disappear. It simply migrated into a form Japan could not answer, because there were no resources left to counter it. To challenge American bombardment required aircraft to strike ships, submarines to harass them, fuel to keep fleets mobile, and ammunition to sustain shore batteries. By 1944, those pillars were cracking. Carriers and trained pilots had been bled away. Fuel was scarce. Shipping was hunted. Even when guns existed on an island, the supply chain that made them meaningful often did not. As a result, the islands that had once been imagined as shields, outer rings of defense, stepping stones of containment, became liabilities. Each garrison tied down men and supplies that could not be replaced, while American firepower grew more efficient with every operation. The islands did not stop the advance. They merely marked its path. In this new reality, civilian and military losses began to blur. As battles moved closer to populated areas and bombardments intensified, the separation between fortress and homeland weakened. The sea's reach extended inward, and the consequences were no longer confined to soldiers in uniform. Above all, the industrial disparity became undeniable. This was not simply a contest between fleets, it was a contest between production systems. One side could fire thousands of heavy shells and replenish them. The other side counted rounds and prayed for a decisive moment that never arrived. And so the sea began to dictate the land war. Shorelines were shaped by ships. Timetables were written by guns. The defenders could still choose to fight, but they could no longer choose the terms. The consequences rippled forward into every remaining battle, each one beginning with the same question Japan had learned too late to fear: how do you defend land when the ocean has become artillery? The Pacific War did not simply end with new borders and broken fleets. It ended with a new understanding of what modern power looked like when it was organized, measured, and applied. American naval doctrine was permanently transformed, not by a single brilliant invention, but by the repeated proof that sea power could shape land battles with a precision once reserved for armies. In that transformation, the battleship found an unexpected second life. In the early war years, it seemed condemned by the aircraft carrier, reduced to escort duty or a symbol of an older age. Yet, as the island campaigns advanced, those great hulls became indispensable again. Floating artillery platforms whose armor allowed them to linger, whose magazines allowed them to sustain fire, and whose guns could reach inland with effects no field battery could match. They were no longer dueling instruments. They were instruments of preparation. This demanded joint operations at a scale rarely seen before. Naval gunfire was coordinated with spotter planes, with Marines and soldiers moving ashore, with engineers clearing beaches, with logistic ships feeding ammunition and fuel into a continuous flow. The battlefield became a network, sea, sky, and land fused into one mechanism. Modern warfare was no longer just about separate branches cooperating, it was about separate branches becoming inseparable. After the war, militaries studied these bombardments closely, not out of nostalgia but out of necessity. The questions were practical: how to integrate sensors and shooters, how to standardize procedures, how to maintain tempo without losing accuracy. In many ways, the islands became classrooms for the 20th century's larger lesson: that industrialized firepower, when guided by information, could compress the time between decision and destruction. Japan's experience became a warning written in shattered coral and scorched rock. Not a warning about cowardice, its soldiers had demonstrated endurance beyond question, but a warning about preparation. Courage could still matter, but technology was beginning to define the limits within which courage could operate. That is the uncomfortable legacy of overwhelming firepower. It does not eliminate human will, but it can render will strategically irrelevant when it cannot influence the system attacking it. And long after surrender, long after the last battleship returned to port, the lesson remained, waiting for the next war to ask whether anyone had truly listened. Years later, when survivors tried to describe what happened on those islands, many returned to the same detail: not the sight of ships, not the faces of enemy soldiers, but the sound. Or rather, the way sound behaved. The guns were distant, often invisible, and yet they dominated everything. A measured concussion that arrived again and again, impersonal and endless, as if the ocean itself had learned a new language and refused to stop speaking it. What unsettled them was not only the destruction, but the lack of emotion in it. Bombardment did not hate, it did not rush, it did not need to see the men it was crushing. It simply corrected, repeated, and continued until positions became dust and command became silence. To be defeated by a human enemy can still feel like a duel. To be defeated by method feels like being erased. In the end, Imperial Japan was forced to confront a painful contrast between the wars it prepared for and the war it actually faced. It had trained for decisive encounters, for night attacks, for moments when bravery could be witnessed and therefore mattered. It had built an ethic around endurance, believing that spirit could compensate for steel. Those beliefs produced astonishing acts of courage. They also produced blindness, because the Americans arrived with a different faith. Faith in arithmetic, in manufacturing, in sensors and firing tables, in the idea that if enough shells could be delivered precisely enough, courage would still exist, but it would no longer decide outcomes. honor would remain real, yet strategically irrelevant. The shockwave of naval gunfire did not end when the guns went quiet. It outlived the battles in doctrine, in memory, and in the very shape of how modern militaries learned to combine information with force. It was one of the war's quieter revolutions, less famous than carriers and atomic bombs, but felt by every soldier who later faced an enemy he could not reach. History, when it records these campaigns honestly, does not describe a failure of bravery. The men on those islands endured what few could endure. It records something colder, a failure of preparation. They trained for courage. They never prepared for the guns.